Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Syed Haider with the Dr. Haider Show. And today I have a tremendous guest, Geert Vanden Bosssche. Um, I'm sure a lot of you know him already, but for those who have not heard from him before, I'm just going to give him a quick introduction and then bring him on. So, Geert Vanden Bosssche received his DVM from the University of Ghent in Belgium and his PhD degree in virology from the University of Hohenheim, Germany. He held adjunct faculty appointments at universities in both Belgium and Germany. And after his career in academia, he joined several vaccine companies, including GSK Biologicals, Novartis Vaccines, and Solvay Biologicals, and served various roles in the vaccine R&D departments as well as in late vaccine development. He then moved on to join the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Global Health Discovery Team in Seattle, in the US, and as a senior program officer. And he worked with the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, or Gavi, in Geneva as senior Ebola program manager. At Gavi, he tracked efforts to develop an Ebola vaccine. He also represented Gavi in fora with other partners, including the WHO, to review progress on the fight against Ebola and to build plans for global pandemic preparedness. And then back in 2015, he scrutinized and questioned the safety of the Ebola vaccine that was used in ring vaccination trials conducted by the WHO in Guinea. His critical scientific analysis and report on the data published by the WHO and the Lancet in 2015 was sent to all international health and regulatory authorities involved in the Ebola vaccination program. After working for Gavi, he joined the German Center for Infection Research in Cologne as head of the Vaccine Development Office. And he is at present primarily serving as a biotech and vaccine consultant while also conducting his own research on natural killer cell based vaccines. He can be found at voiceforscienceindsolidarity.org. That's voice for, and it's just spelled out the way it sounds, voiceforscienceindsolidarity.org. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Geert Vanden Bosssche. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks.
It's an absolute pleasure. I mean, you've done so much to raise awareness around the world of some of the problems around the global vaccine rollout and the global vaccination program. And you've spoken about the issues given the fact that these are leaky vaccines that are not slowing the spread of the virus. And you've spoken about the danger of a pandemic of variants or the likelihood that these vaccines, because they're leaky, may be leading to the development of further variants. And I know that you're on your website. It looks like in May, let me just pull that up for everyone to see. In May, you published a new report here, predictions on the evolution of the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you just tell us about what that report shows in brief?
Yeah, well, these are my predictions in the longer term of what the virus is going to do, and I felt an absolute need to publish this. It's a quite extensive report. I basically wrote it at the end of March, but I just updated it according, I would say, to the new situation, because now there is, I would say, this feeling amongst a number of scientists that the pandemic is dying out because Omicron is very often pretty mild, causes mild infection, causes sometimes even asymptomatic infection. And people are left with the impression, so including our public health authorities, that this is a good sign. The virus is very infectious, as we know, Omicron, and it's not causing too much harm. So that is what is going to provide us with herd immunity. That is what is ultimately going to control the pandemic. And that is a completely wrong estimation of the current situation. It's a complete misjudgment. And I'm explaining in this report what exactly the virus is doing and what are what is the scientific evidence that my predictions are based upon. So it's very important, I think, at least to make my peers in industry, in academia, but also the public health authorities aware that some people have a very good understanding of what is going on and where this pandemic is going, and that at no time, at no point in the future, they will be able to tell well, we didn't know this was unpredictable, this was unprecedented, etc. Because what I'm predicting actually is that the virus will backfire in a way that is completely unprecedented and that will cause, unfortunately, a lot of harm. And because I hate to be a doom and or gloom preacher, I have taken a deep, deep dive into these matters. I've worked on this paper for at least 3-4 weeks, almost day and night, to put as many scientific evidence together that supports my predictions and that support my scientific interpretation and my scientific insights. And so far, I told you, Said, I initially posted it in March. It has not been fact-checked yet, and I can tell you it will be extremely difficult to fact-check because it's simply based on plenty of scientific evidences that serve, in fact, as pieces of a puzzle that I'm putting together based on my knowledge and my experience in vaccinology, in immunology, and in virology. So that is what this report is about. It is primarily, and I send it all to all public health authorities, to FDA, to NIH, to the WHO, etc., for them to know that there is very clearly people that, based on scientific evidence, are warning, continue to warn against the very deleterious development of this pandemic, which they tend to make people believe is over. Recently, Fauci was even saying, oh, well, the pandemic phase is over, and this thing is now becoming endemic, and we will need to live with it, right? So, yeah, over to you, Sai.
Yeah. So, what exactly are you warning will happen next? And has anyone responded to your warnings so far? You sent them an earlier warning, and now this one. Has anyone gotten back in touch with you from the WHO or the FDA or any of these organizations in any country to debate you or to ask you for more information? Has anyone replied?
No, well, debate will no longer happen. They have pushed it so far that I think for them there is no way back. But I do think that they do read my reports, and I think that even because I even sent this report to Bill Gates in person, for example, and you may have noticed that very recently, even Bill Gates was warning against. Kind of like unfavorable development of this pandemic that he would not rule out. And initially, he was kind of like suggesting that it would maybe be unlikely, but it seems like he doesn't think anymore that it is that unlikely. But to your question, what I'm warning against is, let me first tell you the following. At the beginning, we have been warning against the fact that these vaccines could not prevent the transmission of the virus. So that these vaccines, by using them in a mass vaccination program, would not be capable of taming the infectiousness of the virus, and that the virus would continue to transmit. And so what we saw was that at the end of the day, well, basically right now, we got a virus that is highly infectious, namely Omicron. So, in other words, what we have been doing, what we realize, what we have been doing right now is that with this mass vaccination, all we have been doing is putting the infectiousness of the virus under tremendous pressure. So we have been chasing this virus, putting tremendous pressure on the infectiousness of the virus without being able to cut, of course, the chain of transmission. So it seems very clear to me, and there is, of course, a lot of scientific evidence to back up this insight, that now that we have a highly infectious virus that doesn't seem to be very virulent, that doesn't seem to be very pathogenic, that all we are doing is, in fact, suppressing the virulence, the pathogenicity of this virus. So initially, we didn't realize that we thought we were, in fact, having an impact on the infectiousness of the virus, but the virus came back, overcame this pressure that we were putting on the virus, and now strains like Omicron, and there are several different variants and subvariants, as you know, are even more infectious and highly infectious. So the virus overcame this pressure. The virus is now still highly infectious, but it's less virulent. And what I'm saying, and what I have been shown indirectly, is that what we are doing right now by continuing the mass vaccination is that, in fact, we are suppressing the pathogenicity, the virulence of the virus. And it is very clear that the virus will also overcome this second hurdle. The first hurdle was to overcome the pressure on infectiousness. It has done this because Omicron has become dominant. Right now, it is working to overcome the pressure on the virulence of the virus.
And can you just explain for everyone what you mean by immune pressure, and how the vaccination program is exerting some kind of pressure on the virus to evolve in certain directions, and why is it evolving to become more infectious, first of all, and then why do you think it's now evolving to become more virulent?
Yeah, well, that's of course a very important question. Well, the immune pressure is always due to the kind of immune response that we induce. And very clearly, these vaccines are directed or targeted at the spike protein. And we know the spike protein is responsible for infectiousness of the virus. So when you start to immunize large cohorts of the population, not when you are just like vaccinating one segment of the population, like we do with the flu vaccine, where we just vaccinate the elderly or the vulnerable. If you start to vaccinate large cohorts of the population across all age groups, so to say, and you are not able to prevent the virus from transmitting and infecting, then the antibodies that you will generate will basically make life of the virus very difficult, but it will not prevent the virus from replicating and transmitting. And so that is what we call putting immune pressure by virtue, of course, of the antibodies, putting immune pressure on the infectiousness of the virus, because the antibodies are directed against the spike, and spike is responsible for the infectiousness. Now, as a matter of fact, some people have shown in vitro that these antibodies that are now, in fact, that are induced by the vaccines, but to which Omicron has now become largely resistant. Remember, Omicron is now largely resistant to the potentially neutralizing antibodies that are induced by the vaccines. So scientists have, in several different publications, clearly demonstrated that because of this situation, the non-neutralizing antibodies against spike are now becoming predominant. So this is to say that if the neutralizing capacity of the antibodies diminishes because the virus becomes resistant to the antibodies, then and only then the non-neutralizing antibodies can bind to the virus. When the neutralizing antibodies bind to the virus, the non-neutralizing antibodies have no chance to bind to the virus. If the neutralizing capacity diminishes, that means that the strength of binding of the neutralizing antibodies diminishes because the virus becomes resistant to those neutralizing antibodies. Then the strength of the non-neutralizing antibodies, the binding strength to the S protein, becomes much stronger. So now,
these non-neutralizing antibodies are found in both vaccinated and unvaccinated?
Well, these non-neutralizing antibodies are induced by, contact, of course, with the S protein. So the S protein induces antibodies that are neutralized, that are non-neutralizing. It's just, you have to understand this the following way, that is the way I explain this. When the neutralizing antibodies bind, because they have strong affinity, they have neutralizing capacity, by binding to the spike protein, there is a kind of structural change of the spike protein. We call this a conformational change, a change of the conformation that is the result of the binding of the neutralizing antibodies. When that happens, the non-neutralizing antibodies that recognize other sites on the spike protein they can no longer recognize their site of binding, right?
Right. Right.
However, when the non-neutralizing antibodies lose binding strength because the virus becomes resistant to these antibodies, then the non-neutralizing antibodies, because the conformational change has not taken place, can still recognize their binding site and they will bind. And here comes the important thing. These non-neutralizing antibodies, and this has clearly been shown, that is not an interpretation of mine, or this has clearly been demonstrated. These non-neutralizing antibodies, they can enhance the infectiousness of the virus. So that means that somebody who is sitting on antibodies that have no longer neutralizing capacity, for example, somebody who got vaccinated has plenty of antibodies, but these antibodies are directed against the Wuhan strain, whereas now we have the Omicron. So somebody who is sitting on these non-neutralizing antibodies will become much more susceptible to the infection, because these non-neutralizing antibodies will bind to the spike protein, and by binding to the spike protein, the infectiousness of the virus increases. And again, this has been shown in peer-reviewed journals that people who are vaccinated are more susceptible to infection with Omicron, right? So now there is something even more important. So what I told you so far is pretty simple. Initially, we have been putting immune pressure on the virus by doing mass vaccination. The virus has overcome this immune pressure because we were unable to prevent the virus from replicating and transmitting. And the virus has pushed it so far that it has even become largely resistant to these potentially neutralizing antibodies. As an immediate consequence of that, the non-neutralizing antibodies are now capable of binding much stronger to the spike protein, and by doing so, they are making the virus more infectious for all those who are sitting on such non-neutralizing antibodies. And these are primarily, of course, vaccinees, because they have all been vaccinated with spike protein from the Wuhan strain, whereas now we have an Omicron that is completely different. So that is one thing. The second thing, to your question, because you were asking me where is my evidence, where this is going, and why am I warning against, first of all, more infectiousness, which has happened, and secondarily now, to a more dangerous virus. Well, people have shown, scientists have shown in vitro studies, but it's very compelling, that the very same non-neutralizing antibodies that are increasing the infectiousness at the upper respiratory tract are at the same time responsible for preventing severe disease in distant organs like the lower respiratory tract, but even other organs like, for example, the gastroenterodigestive tract. And that is a process that has been relatively well described, in a sense that you have to imagine the virus in the upper respiratory tract is to some extent caught by dendritic cells that are just sitting in the mucosa. And these are sentinels. They are just watching if there is something to catch. The virus will attach to these dendritic cells, will not be internalized, but will be absorbed to the surface of the dendritic cells. And these dendritic cells now serve as vehicles to transport the virus down to the lower respiratory tract. Okay? So there, at the lower respiratory tract, there is a process that we call transinfection. What means transinfection? Transinfection is the transfer of a virus that is adsorbed to those dendritic cells, transfer from these dendritic cells to epithelial lung cells, alveolar cells that are susceptible to the virus. So the virus is transferred from one cell to which it was adsorbed at the surface to another cell that is susceptible, an alveolar lung cell. And that process is called transinfection. So now these people have shown, again, that the very same non-neutralizing antibodies that enhance the infection at the upper respiratory tract can prevent the trans-infection. And when you prevent the trans-infection, you prevent these lung cells from being infected. You prevent these lung cells from building, we call them syncytia. These are several different cells that are confluent and that are a sign of pathogenicity. So these syncytia have been clearly correlated with severe disease in people who died from severe disease. So what I'm saying is that now we are in a situation where vaccinees are sitting, because of Omicron, on non-neutralizing antibodies that enhance the infectiousness at the upper respiratory tract. That's why they become more susceptible to infection, but that at the same time is still suppressing severe disease at the lower respiratory tract, because these antibodies, these very same antibodies, can inhibit the process of trans-infection. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that now the virus is put under immune pressure from the non-neutralizing antibodies that prevent it from becoming more virulent, from causing severe disease. And provided we sustain this immune pressure, it is very clear that the virus will overcome this, because don't forget, the pressure is tremendous. Omicron is circulating. People have been primed by way of the vaccination. And even if even if these idiots don't decide to come with an Omicron vaccine, everyone in the population is now boosted with Omicron because it is circulating. The vaccinees who are having non-neutralizing antibodies are highly susceptible. So they are highly susceptible to priming. So these non-neutralizing antibodies will very soon reach elevated titers in the vaccinees. And the more people we vaccinate, the higher the prevalence of these elevated titers of non-neutralizing antibodies. You can imagine all this stuff is putting tremendous pressure, no longer on the infectiousness of the virus. That has been done, that has been taken care of, but now on the virulence. And in that paper, I have even predicted what molecular changes could enable the virus to stay very infectious, but at the same time to increase its virulence. And this has to do with a kind of mutation site nobody's talking about, which is, in virology, we know this is very, very important, is the insertion of a sugar at a specific domain, a glycan. We know that glycans, this is textbook virology, that glycans play a critical role, first of all, in subverting the immune system, because the glycans that are sitting on the envelope of the virus, these are self-glycans. The virus is coming out of the cell and it is getting enveloped, in fact, so to say, with the membrane of the cell that carries glycans of our own body, and therefore these glycans are not recognized by the host immune system because they are recognized as cells, whereas they can they can shield large domains on the spike protein so that these domains can no longer be recognized by the immune system. So it has been very clearly documented that the glycans, sugars on viruses, are not only responsible for infectiousness, for causing virulence, but essentially also for immune subversion, for misleading the immune system and hiding certain antigenic sites on the spike protein in order to prevent the immune system from recognizing those. When you read all these publications and all this stuff on mutations of the virus, do you ever read something on glycosylation? This is the process of building sugar. Whereas approximately 40% of SarsCoV2, of the surface of SaRS-CoV-2 is covered by glycans, right? It would just suffice the insertion of 1 or 2 additional glycans for the virus to very rapidly escape to these non-neutralizing antibodies in order to increase virulence while still maintaining a high level of infectiousness. I'm not going to elaborate on how exactly that works. People who are interested, especially also people who have a biological background or whatever, they can look into my manifesto of 45 pages where I'm predicting, guys, this is going to happen. We have been disturbing this balance between the virus and the immune system. This is a very delicate balance that during a natural pandemic gets under control after 2-3 waves within 6 or 8, maybe 10 months, and where ultimately there is herd immunity. The herd immunity will control the virus. It will not wipe out the virus, but it will control the virus. It will enable the virus to continue to persist while not causing severe damage to the population. The damage is only caused by the waves that will, of course, to some extent, be lethal for people with underlying diseases, elderly people, etc. But even those people, to a large extent, can be saved, provided we would allow them to be treated with early treatment, of course, which, you see. So, but my point is, we have been severely disturbing a kind of equilibrium that has been established over millions of years, not just for SARS-CoV2, but in general, how a pathogenic learns to live with the population without wiping out the population, still giving the pathogen a chance to replicate. All of a sudden, we are throwing a bombshell on this balance. Why I'm saying a bombshell? Because the kind of immunity that is induced by the vaccines is not generating herd immunity. It's not generating sterilizing immunity. You heard me saying, on the contrary, it is promoting the propagation of more and more infectious variants, and therefore it is enhancing the infectivity rate in the population. The infectivity rate in the population has never been that high as it is now. Of course, many of these infections are not reported because they are mild or moderate. People don't go to the hospital. People don't go to see their doctor because they have just, some mild disease. But the infection rate, it just, and the transmission, it just all over the place, right? This is exactly the opposite from what these vaccines were meant to do, generating herd immunity. And this is exactly the opposite from what natural immunity does during a natural pandemic, because the people who are not vaccinated, they will be able, thanks to their innate immunity, and if they get a disease, you have to some extent acquired immunity, they will be able to generate sterilizing immunity, diminish the transmission, and because of the diminishment of the transmission, even vulnerable people, could be protected. That is the definition of herd immunity. Make sure that, the bulk of your population has sufficient sterilizing immunity so that people who didn't get immunized or have a weak immune system are automatically protected, because the likelihood for them to get infected has become so low because the transmission rate has been lowered to a very significant extent.
Over. So, the authorities are saying that the vaccine, they've basically admitted that the vaccines don't stop the spread, but they continue to harp on the, this, what they believe to be the efficacy of the vaccines for preventing severe disease, right? So it'll prevent hospitalization and death. This is what everyone's saying, and this is the reason now to continue to vaccinate. So you're telling me that the people who have been vaccinated are at higher risk now, correct? What should they be doing right now? Should they be continuing to get boosters, or should they stop the boosters and go for early treatment? Because so many people have been vaccinated at this point in the world.
Yeah. Well, let me first, because there is several aspects, things in your question. The first thing is with regard to protection against severe disease. Let's be very clear that you will never, ever control a pandemic by using hospitalizations as a metric. Why? Because hospitalizations have nothing to do with the infection rate and the transmission rate in the population. You heard me saying you can only control a pandemic provided you control the transmission rate and you diminish the transmission rate. So they are using the wrong metric, and You could say, yeah, but it is successful. Yes, when you are short-sighted, and if you have not learned to look beyond the end of your nose, you could say, wow, today there is fewer hospitalizations.
Mm.
What I'm telling you is that this diminishment in hospitalization is due to a suppression of severe disease that is due to non-neutralizing antibodies. This pressure is becoming massive while more and more people are vaccinated, whereas the vaccines do not work anymore because they cannot no longer induce neutralizing antibodies, and they are boosted all the time by the circulating Omicron. So that means that when this change, when this variant will come, that I'm predicting for sure, everybody will be, all vaccinees will be in bad shape. And when they will then still use their metric of hospitalization, of course, I mean, it will be too late because, the system will simply crash. So in the short term, and that is so tricky and so difficult for people to understand, if you look at a very short term, right now, this is a very delicate equilibrium. It's not going to last. It's not stable because there is this tremendous immune pressure. We have seen it with the immune pressure on the infectiousness. It didn't hold at the beginning. Yes, there was some diminishment of the transmission. It held for a few months maybe, and then there was no longer impact of transmission. So the virus is going to break through this pressure. Why? Well, because it can still replicate. And if it can still replicate, you have plenty of mutants, and the virus will have plenty of choice to naturally select those mutants that can overcome the pressure that is preventing it from thriving, right? So that is very, very clear. So what should these people
just let me jump in real quick. Just one point here. So the way, I'm not a virologist, I'm just an MD. And so we don't learn as much as you do, and nowhere near. But our kind of simplified understanding of things is that viruses tend to evolve away from, causing serious disease, because if they kill the host, they'll have less chance of spreading.
That's a nonsense. All a virus can do, is it can replicate. We agree. It can mutate. It can hide in our genomes, like viruses like HIV, CMV virus, etc. But the virus has no brains. A virus will not say at some point in time, oh, wow, guys, I've done sufficient harm to this population. I'm going to tune down a little bit. If this impression of people exists, that the virus gets attenuated, this is simply due to the fact that the population is building natural immunity. And by building natural immunity, look at the natural pandemic. You have this wave, and then you have a second wave, and the third wave is already a much lower and smaller wave, and then it is disappearing. So the smaller wave, you could say the virus is attenuated, it has become milder. No, the immunity has grown, and immunity, because it's sterilizing immunity, this natural immunity, has wiped out the virus to a large extent. It will not eradicate it, it will just control it, right? So that is a completely wrong and false impression, and that is all based on a natural pandemic. The situation we have right now, it's completely unprecedented. We never, ever had this. We have never been doing mass vaccination campaigns in the midst of a pandemic with non-live vaccines. This is a non-live vaccine. This is not a live attenuated vaccine. This is not like the measles or the mumps or the rubella or the oral poliovirus or whatever, right? So that is my answer to that question. Now, what these people should do? Well, very clearly, so what I'm saying, and this should be simple, the culprit are the non-neutralizing antibodies, where people, essentially the vaccinees, have high titers of those non-neutralizing antibodies that are continuously boosted by the circulating Omicron. So we need to prevent this continuous boosting of antibodies that have a detrimental impact. Right now, they're still preventing severe disease, I agree, but they are generating massive pressure, and the virus will break through that pressure. So indirectly, and at the midterm, they have a very detrimental impact. And so in order to diminish that immune pressure, because that is driving immune escape, that is driving the virus to escape from that pressure, for God's sake, what we need to do is we need to bring down the infection rate in the population. We need to bring down this infectious pressure. The only way this can be done, is the same at an individual level. When people get infected, especially vulnerable people, use, for God's sake, antivirals as soon as you can. If you have a massive population that is continuously exposed to the virus, so exposed to high infectious pressure, if you want this population to prevent this population from exerting huge immune pressure, you have to bring down the infection rate by massive antiviral chemoprophylaxis campaigns, not mass vaccination campaigns. Of course, those need to be stopped immediately. I mean, this is a complete nonsense. It's the worst thing ever. We would need to replace them in highly vaccinated countries, not in countries in Africa that have like 2 or 5% coverage. Don't care about those. But in highly vaccinated countries, what we would need to do immediately, because the virus is now, right now, as we speak, breeding these these infectious variants that are, trying to find their way through this barrier of immune pressure on the virulence. And so we need to bring this down. The only way this can be done is mass antiviral chemoprophylaxis campaigns. And, whether this is Paxlovid or whether it's ivermectin, etc., I think it should be with an antiviral that is readily available, right? That is safe and effective, and that can be made available, in sufficient supply and at an affordable cost. And we know this kind of antiviral exists. And I think this is really, there is not 25 things you can do. Of course, you could say, well, we could also diminish this pressure by diluting. We could dilute this pressure by, for example, a baby boom. If we have a baby boom, all of a sudden we have more unvaccinated people. Or we could have massive waves of immigration of people from non-vaccinated countries. This is not going to happen in the short term. Or, of course, ideally, you would have a vaccine that can block transmission, that can really block transmission and induce sterilizing immunity. We don't have those vaccines either. So the only option right now, I'm very serious, is to dramatically diminish the infection rate. And people are not aware because the virus is not doing that much harm right now. And yes, of course, everybody almost gets infected and get a cold and is coughing or has a sore throat, etc. But not that many people are dying. There is not that many hospitalizations. But I tell you, this is going to change. And if we don't act right now, we will for sure come too late.
Okay, so one confusion I have, I guess, is, again, my simplified understanding of virology is that a virus is, the way that it mutates is going to tend to increase its ability to spread through a population, right? And so I think that's why I was saying that if you're killing off too many people, obviously if you're having a low mortality rate, you're not really interfering with the spread too much. But if you get up to like a 90% mortality rate, you could quickly, depending on how quickly a virus spreads, if it spreads and kills people very fast, it's not going to continue to spread to more people, right? It would tend to die out too quickly. But I guess my confusion and my question to you is, why does the evolution work to evade this immune pressure on its virulence? Like, how does that help the virus evolutionarily speaking, right? Like,
Well,
I know it doesn't have a mind, it's not thinking,
yeah.
but
Well,
like in terms of evolution, why would it try to evade that? How does that help it spread?
Well, it's not a mechanism that is well thought through. This is simply, I would say, the principal theory of Darwin, that the organism that is not the strongest, but that is the most adapted, to the current environment will survive. So you have to imagine the virus is replicating all the time. There is plenty of mutations. All of a sudden, you're now, making life difficult for the virus, because you will, of course, to some extent, diminish the viral load by increasing this immune pressure.
Right.
Well, automatically, those mutants that happen by chance, that happen to be more resistant to that environment of pressure, will gain a competitive advantage.
Yeah, that makes sense. Inside that particular body, the
Yeah, it
ones
is
that
a
can spread
natural
to the lungs.
selection. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is a natural selection of
Mm,
variants that in that particular environment, and here the environment is the immune pressure, will gain a competitive advantage, will therefore be fitter than the previous variants. And if you do this at a massive scale, they will even become dominant. If you just do this in a few people, I
yeah.
mean, when this virus is transmitted and they land on the mucosa of people who don't exert this immune pressure, the effect is gone. But if you now do this, across all age groups, this virus is going from one person to the other and regularly encountering this difficult environment. It will go to its garage and it will take the off-road motorcycle that is better suited for this rough,
Yeah.
landscape. Yeah,
Right.
that is simply, the law of Darwin. It's not that the virus is thinking, has a strategy or whatever. I'm telling you, all it can
No,
do
no,
is
it makes
replicate
sense.
and mutate. Yeah.
So, what about people who have not been vaccinated? Are you concerned for them as well? Should they also be concerned with the future variants that might be more
No.
virulent?
No, I mean, and remember, it's not at all my goal. It has never been, and it will never be, to discriminate against, people who are vaccinated or non-vaccinated. This has absolutely nothing to do. But we do need to fundamentally distinguish between the immune status right now of vaccinees who have been primed, unfortunately, with this Wuhan vaccine, and that as a result of that are now sitting on antibodies that can no longer neutralize the Omicron. Of course, the non-vaccinated per definition have not been vaccinated. They are not troubled by these non-neutralizing antibodies. And on the contrary, for these people, the Omicron that is currently circulating is just serving as a live attenuated vaccine. Remember, like a child that has its natural immunity, its innate immunity, you vaccinate it with a live attenuated vaccine, and it will train its innate immune system. It will build some acquired antibodies. The combination of both is going to provide a strong and effective and immunity that is capable of eliminating the virus. So of course they are saying, yeah, you know what? There is also plenty of people who are unvaccinated or landing in a hospital. And then I'm saying, listen, if this is true, and that is true, that Omicron is right now serving as a live attenuated vaccine for the non-vaccinated, and you as an MD will know this, you would never ever vaccinate a vulnerable person, like an elderly person, somebody with underlying disease, or even a young child that is not in good shape, with a live attenuated vaccine. So the people that we are now seeing, the unvaccinated, are landing in those hospitals, the vast majority of them have underlying disease, predisposing conditions, or in one way or the other not in good shape, etc., right? You should never vaccinate with a live attenuated vaccine somebody who is not in good shape. That is
Right.
dangerous. Yeah.
Right.
So that is, but they are taking people who are in good shape, in good health. They are taking advantage of this continuous or repeated exposure to train their immune system. And of course, if the virus breaks through that innate immune system, because we can get the disease, etc., it's no problem getting disease, landing in a hospital, dying, that's a problem. Getting the disease, they build antibodies, and guess what? These antibodies are then immediately directed against the circulating variant, right? That is something very different from anti-Wuhan antibodies that are directed against something that is completely different from, a spike protein that is completely different, right? So,
So
yeah.
some people did have natural immunity to the initial Wuhan strain, right?
The vast majority. Come on,
Right.
I mean, there is a new virus that, all of a sudden gets into our populations, and guess what? Over 90% of people had either asymptomatic infection or they had mild, maybe moderate infection, whereas the population was, immunologically speaking, completely naive, so to say. And they're protected. How can that be? You can only explain this by, innate and natural immunity, of course, right? And that is something that has be completely bypassed. And even worse, because you hear me saying, when you generate antibodies that are very specific against the virus, what we do with normal vaccines, this is a fantastic thing. You prime people, and these antibodies, they are directed, against a specific antigen on the virus. They react with a high affinity, very, very important. With high affinity, they can neutralize. That is no problem. But of course, if you use very specific antibodies against variants, viral species that do no longer resemble, the virus that was used, so to say, for making the vaccine, then of course you have a problem, because these non-neutralizing antibodies at that moment, they're still capable of binding to the virus. By doing that, because they have higher affinity than innate antibodies, they outcompete the innate antibodies without being able themselves to neutralize the virus. So you bypass the innate immune response that naturally, to a large extent, protects people, certainly all healthy people, young people, etc., and certainly children. You bypass this and you replace it by something that is not sufficiently efficient and that enables the virus to, therefore, to escape from that immunity. That is very different from a prophylactic vaccine. Normally, we vaccinate people not in the midst of a pandemic, but we vaccinate people. If you want to travel to a foreign country where there is a certain pathogen, you can protect yourself again by a vaccine. You will make sure that you get the vaccine in the full schedule before you travel to that country. Then you have full-fledged immunity that is immediately directed and specifically to the pathogen that is prevailing in that country. When you then get exposed, once you are in the country, you have full-fledged immunity, and it is directed against that specific pathogen. This is going to work very, very well. If you do this during a pandemic, you're continuously having people that have not gotten the opportunity to build full-fledged immunity, and you are already potentially bombarding them with the virus. So the immunity is not mature, the levels are too low, the virus can easily escape, and that is how ultimately we get to we promote the propagation of more infectious variants. And that's what we have seen. Since the mass vaccination started, we have not been generating new mutants. I never told this, these mutants existed, but we have been promoting the dominant propagation of these mutants, because they got naturally selected, and because we were massively vaccinating the population. They had an opportunity to become dominant, right? And that is what we have been seeing since this mass vaccination.
So if we had not done what we did with the max vaccination programs with leaky vaccines, you're saying we would have seen a natural evolution of this virus, we would have developed herd immunity, and we would have taken care of it by now,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And so the reason we're seeing all these, spikes, we have another wave, and then a few months later, another wave, and another wave, and another wave. This is because of the vaccination program?
Well, this is because of the fact that we are unable to control the infectiousness. So if you look at these curves, you have a curve, smaller peaks, they go down. Most of the times in highly vaccinated countries, they don't even join the baseline anymore. If you look at the natural pandemic, you have a wave, path is joining the baseline, then it takes off again, joining the baseline. Now, you see a decline. It's not joining the baseline anymore. It levels off, and then it is already ready to start a second wave. And you have the intervals between the waves are diminishing. The frequency of these waves becomes higher and higher. And basically, on average, you see that the infectivity level is high, right? So we don't get rid of this high infectious pressure, which would be required in order to drive the virus into an endemic phase. So in other words, we have not enough herd immunity. Why don't we have not enough herd immunity? Because for God's sake, we are preventing the biggest reservoir of herd immunity, like young children, young adults, etc., who have very good, innate immunity and can generate a lot of herd immunity. We are vaccinating them, thereby preventing them from generating that herd immunity. So you can see it in the curves. I mean, there is the infection rate is not declining. And you have to realize that when you look at the curves right now, there is a severe underestimation because, as I told you, many of people get mild disease asymptomatic, and it goes unnoticed, right?
So worst case scenario, what do you predict? Because I don't have faith in most of the governments at any point in the near future changing their trend and going away from
No,
vaccination towards antivirals. I can't imagine that would happen. So
no.
how bad do you think it can get?
Well, let me first tell you, Said, I mean, isn't it extremely worrisome that, and I think even, lay people right now realize this, that even our public health officials and, so to say, our key opinion leaders, they don't understand this thing anymore. They don't know where it is going. They are saying things like, yeah, probably we will have to learn to live with this virus. They don't believe in herd immunity anymore. They do not rule out, look what Bill Gates is saying, that, it will become very dramatic. Others are saying, yeah, we may need to vaccinate people like every 6 months, etc. Come on. The bottom line is they have no clue, they don't understand. And this is very, very, very dangerous. Doing a massive intervention, a massive immune intervention on the population, and really an experiment, something completely unprecedented, not knowing, having no clue where this could potentially go, it's very, very dangerous. That is why I felt a need, to make predictions that are based on scientific evidence. And of course, I can be wrong, but I can tell you that I would first need to see plenty of arguments that are able to undermine the kind of puzzle that I've been putting together with this. Because, of course, and I fully agree with you, I don't expect these officials, to step back and all of a sudden say, well, we need, for example, implementation of mass chemoprophylaxis campaigns with ivermectin, etc., and all this highly effective. We need to start this immediately. It's not going to happen, unfortunately. And so what, for me, unfortunately, is going to be inevitable is that we will see within this in the coming months, in one or the other of the highly vaccinated countries, we will see that viral variants will become dominant that are not only more infectious, but that are more virulent and even highly virulent. And unfortunately, this will first of all affect people who have the highest non-neutralizing antibodies. The sequence how we vaccinated? First the elderly, then younger age groups and adolescents, then the children, etc. That is exactly the sequence, that will be affected by this kind of evolution that tends to generate, or that tends to promote the propagation of viral variants that not only are highly infectious, we do have those already, but also more virulent. And what kind of damage this would cause, and what kind of mortality and morbidity, and what kind of social and health consequences, I don't know. But what I predict for sure is that the health system will crash, right? Because right now, and this never happened before, this never happens during a natural pandemic, that hospitalization rates and death rates are completely disconnected from the infectivity rates. Remember, look at any natural pandemic, and this was also the case with this pandemic at the very beginning. You had an infection wave, a wave of cases. You could predict for sure, few days, few weeks thereafter, we will have more hospitalizations, we will more deaths, etc. Now this is completely disconnected, right? So this is a very, very worrisome evolution. It's simply
when you say it's disconnected, what do you mean by it's disconnected?
Well, that high infection rates are no longer accompanied by high morbidity or high hospitalization rates and high mortality rates, right? I mean, this was also the reason why back in July 21st, Boris Johnson in the UK, for the first time, lifted the lockdown measures, because he was saying, yeah, we have high infection rates, but look, hospitalization and it's pretty low, so we can go. So what you allow the virus to do with this is spread and spread and spread, become more infectious for those who have already been vaccinated and these non-neutralizing antibodies, and therefore you increase even the immune pressure they are putting on the virus, and you drive it to immune escape. So this is going to evolve in an exponential way. It's going to be very, very fast, I think. So that's why I'm saying I'm expecting this kind of evolution within the next few months. I'm not saying that all of a sudden a highly infectious and a highly virulent variant will pop up at one single country and it will spread all over the world. I think if the conditions are the same, very highly vaccinated countries, they are having the same conditions right now, the same immune conditions. That's also why you see that Omicron thrives in all these highly vaccinated countries, right? I mean, there is no distinction, so to say. So it could be in parallel that this evolution towards dominant propagation of more infectious and more virulent variants, evolves in parallel in several different countries. And of course, and that is what I'm explaining also in my manifesto, these glycan chains can grow. And the more they grow, the more they can resist immune pressure. But the more they resist the immune pressure, of course, I mean, the more important also the impact will be on the virulence, for example. So you could imagine that we would have a pretty rapid sequence of more infectious and more virulent strains that are going to succeed one another, right? So that is what I'm predicting. I'm definitely predicting, no doubt about this, that the virus will backfire and that we will, unfortunately, in contrast to what Fauci and a number of these experts are saying, that we will not be left with a mild virus that is highly infectious and that we will have to live with and that we can control by continuing vaccinating people, etc. That is now not how evolutionary biology works. That is not how a virus works. That sets a new generation on the globe every 10 hours. The life cycle is 10, 12 hours for a virus to replicate. So now where we have reservoirs even in animals, where we have plenty of opportunity for recombination of different variants within the same person, reassortance, etc., where we have high infectious pressure, where there is plenty of mutants, there is plenty of opportunity for the virus to select the mutants that can overcome this immune pressure, right? So it's no longer like at the beginning. And that is why I'm saying we should get back to the beginning with the Wuhan, where the infectious pressure was pretty low. The only way to do that is to massively implement antiviral chemoprophylaxis. But I agree with you, they're stubborn. They cannot get back anymore. It's too late. They cannot afford to lose their face, and they will continue, unfortunately. And if these things start to become pretty worrisome, for them, it will probably even be a sign or a signal to move on with the Omicron vaccination, right? So that is the unfortunate thing when there is no debate possible anymore about science and about these complex things, because this is very complex, the interaction between a virus, the immune system at the population level, taking into account human intervention with vaccines, etc., etc. And if this is not taken seriously, and if the science is ridiculed, and if people are simply told, what, don't worry about this, get your shot, make sure your children get the shot, and you'll be fine. I mean, yeah, what? Then you can only leave it to nature. There is no other choice.
So, and if they double down on the current approach and develop Omicron-specific vaccines, what happens then? What happens then?
Well, what happens, is, I mean, if you follow the logic, what I'm saying is that Omicron, the circulating Omicron, is now already leading to a higher prevalence of, people sitting on high antibody titers of non-neutralizing antibodies. When on top, you're now going to vaccinate these people who have already been primed and are already generating these non-neutralizing antibodies with Omicron, you're just going to expedite this. You're just going to expedite the growth of the immune pressure on the virus. And in this case, it is the immune pressure exerted by the non-neutralizing antibodies. This is to say, the immune pressure exerted on the virulence. Initially, it was the immune pressure exerted by the neutralizing antibodies, this was the immune pressure exerted on the infectiousness, right? It's as simple as that.
And people who have natural immunity, in the last couple of years, they developed natural immunity, maybe from the first variant or from variants afterwards. You think that even with the increased virulence, if they're healthy, they'll still be safe because of their
Well,
natural immunity?
the funny thing, so first of all, you heard me saying that people who are sitting on these non-neutralizing antibodies, vaccinees, are becoming more susceptible because these non-neutralizing antibodies bind to the virus and make it more infectious. Remember, this is very important to understand. It's unprecedented. And that is why virologists, you can no longer have a debate with virologists because they don't understand this. They see the virus as an isolated thing that has its infectious behavior intrinsically. What I'm saying is that now the intrinsic infectiousness of the virus is completely modulated by the fact that it is bound to non-neutralizing antibodies, right? And that is now determining the infectious behavior. First of all, the non-vaccinated don't have this enhanced susceptibility to the infection, and of course, secondarily, this. The virus, there's also something I'm explaining in the manifesto. The virus will need to implement changes, mutations, in order to overcome, the pressure from the non-neutralizing antibodies. These changes, these mutations will not fit with an immune environment where these non-neutralizing antibodies are not available or not present. So I'm even predicting that the fact that this mutation that will affect the majority of the population, namely the vaccinees, and that will be able to overcome the break on the virulence that is taking place right now, that this type of variants will no longer be able to cause severe disease, even in people who are theoretically vulnerable, provided, of course, they are not vaccinated. Because this mutation will no longer fit the immune status of the... So, in fact, the virus is adapting
to become more virulent in people who are vaccinated specifically.
Exactly. The combination with these non-neutralizing antibodies, that is what the virus is adapting to. Yeah,
it's terrifying.
It's terrifying. It is, how should I say, on one hand side, it is intriguing, it is fascinating. The versatility, the power of evolution, the power of nature, how sophisticated this works, right? It's just fascinating. On the other hand, when humans intervene in a way that is completely thoughtless, right? That is arrogant, so to say, that is not based on science, this can have, of course, a very...
So was all of this predictable from day one with the vaccine programs? I mean, did you have this fear right from the start, or is this kind of your thought process developed during the pandemic?
The only thing where I, I mean, very clearly, I've been ringing the alarm bell, I say, from the very beginning when I heard that they would do mass vaccination with vaccines, during the pandemic, in the midst of a pandemic, with vaccines that are not capable of, cutting the chain of transmission, because that would drive immune escape. This is almost like textbook knowledge. What I didn't know is that the virus would proceed in two steps. It would first overcome the pressure on infectiousness. And remember, it's very interesting. When you push this infectiousness, the variants became more and more infectious. When you push it to the extreme, you end up with a virus that becomes even resistant to the neutralizing antibodies. That enables the conversion to the immune pressure from the non-neutralizing antibodies, because those are, so somewhere you need this conversion. You can only have this conversion from one immune pressure on infectiousness to immune pressure on virulence, provided you generate non-neutralizing antibodies, or you have the preponderance of non-neutralizing antibodies, which can only take place when the virus becomes, of course, resistant to the potentially neutralizing antibodies, right? So it is proceeding in two steps. I didn't forecast this. But yeah, that is what is the case, and the first step has clearly taken place. All you see right now is that the Omicron is still, some variants are still becoming a little bit more infectious than the previous one, but we are reaching this plateau. And in the meantime, we are already, by virtue of these non-neutralizing antibodies, exerting a lot of immune pressure on viral virulence. I mean, that is not a stable situation. You can believe me. This protection against severe disease right now is not real immunity, right? It is just inhibition of the transinfection at the lower respiratory tract, but that will be overcome because it is an immune pressure. It is exerted by antibodies, right? And that pressure can be overcome because we cannot kill the virus, because we cannot prevent it from transmitting. It has never transmitted, at that speed and at that intensity. It's just that much of this remains below the surface because it's largely asymptomatic or mild, or even people have moderate disease. They know, oh yeah, Omicron, it's unlikely that I'm going to die, so I can stay in bed and I won't worry about it. So it remains unnoticed. Many cases, right?
Yeah, we've been
Okay.
talking for a little over an hour. Thank you so much. I
Yeah.
mean, if you have a couple more minutes, I just have a couple more questions for you. Do you need to go?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Please go ahead. I mean.
Okay. So looking back at the pandemic, you've made a lot of predictions so far. Been completely wrong at all, or have your predictions really played out the way that you were saying things would happen? That's how it's happened.
Yeah, well, as I just told you, I thought that the virulence and infectiousness would evolve at the same time. That has not happened. We have had a first stage where the virus, become more infectious. I should say, where the mass vaccination has promoted the propagation of highly infectious strains. So that has happened. That was right.
Yeah.
But that, then the evolution to more virulent would only happen in a second stage and would therefore delay a little bit the kind of catastrophic consequences that I have been predicting in March 2021. That will get delayed because it's in two stages. I thought this could maybe take place in one stage, but I'm telling you, it is so sophisticated. When the virus would do that in one stage, it would all of a sudden give too much of advantage to the virus, wipe out the population, and then there would not be. So the virus does, it's really, it goes high infectiousness and then it starts, because why? Because it's highly infectious. But if you have many asymptomatic cases, very mild diseases, that is not an interesting situation for the virus to replicate and propagate. It prefers to have people shed lots of virus, people who have really the disease or even have severe disease. And therefore, it becomes now, it's highly infectious, it spreads, but, the shedding is relatively limited. So it will add, now progressively another stage where it will become on top more virulent.
So just one more question, and I'll let you go. So you're not the only virologist in the world, obviously. You're the only one who's speaking out like this. But behind the scenes, are you in touch with other virologists who have the same, thoughts that you're having, who agree with you, or are they
Of
really in
course.
disagreement?
A few, but so I would say, I think it's very important to be humble and not to overestimate your knowledge. For example, you will never hear me talk about, in depth about side effects or early treatment or this type of things. Not that I'm completely unaware, not that I'm not following this, but I'm not a deep expert in this field. I've already been concentrating on this interplay between virus and the immune system for a long time, long before the COVID pandemic started. And, putting together these different disciplines and virology and evolutionary biology, and immunology and vaccinology and even biophysics. To some extent, I was heading up, a division of biophysical characterization in the vaccine business. Studying the interactions, for example, of several different components with vaccines, etc. Like we are talking about different type of interaction of innate antibodies with the spike compared to the specific antibodies. All this, and I'm certainly not an icon or a superstar in any of these disciplines, but I think in all modesty that I'm one of the very few that is able to bring these pieces of the puzzle together in a way that the puzzle makes sense, and that you can compare this to what is actually happening, and that you can explain this, and that you can predict this and validate your hypothesis, these predictions. But yes, of course, there are people who are behind the scene telling me, yeah, Geert, I mean, we support this, this is right, etc. There is few, and certainly people, who are still in their official positions, they will refrain, of course, from raising their voice and speaking out. Unfortunately, this is very, very unfortunate. But I was always saying, in my first interview, that one of the most renowned vaccinologists on this planet, I will not disclose his name, who knows me pretty well, told me from the very beginning, Geert, you're right. These vaccines are just going to breed variants, but nobody will listen to you, right? I mean, this goes beyond the science side. I mean, there is so many things involved. I get criticized, I get fact checked, not that much anymore. But nobody from industry where I learned my job, is criticizing me, is telling here, what kind of nonsense are you telling? These are the people who know what's going on. It's not in academia, right? I mean, they are living in their ivory towers where they're specialized either in vaccinology or in immunology or in virology. But in these companies, they have the luxury, they have the money to bring the best epidemiologists, immunologists, virologists, vaccinologists, molecular biologists around the same table, right? If you earn $4,000 or $5,000 a month as a professor of immunology, they want to have you. They tell you, should we double this or triple this? Just let us know, right? These are the people, and they have the opportunity to put these people around the same table and to discuss. But of course, I mean, this is now a game of their shareholders, right? Make money. WHO being completely ignorant and incompetent, they have completely misjudged the situation and opened the door to industry. Of course, if you open the door to industry, I mean, that is their objective. That is their business plan, is to make money and to enrich the shareholders. You cannot stop this, right? That is how you have to see this. You don't even have to go to kind of like conspiracy theories, etc. If you see how this works, I had an opportunity to look behind the scenes of these global health authorities and in industry and etc. So it's no longer about the scientists. I have a dream. Yeah, my dream is that one should replace the vaccine mandates by debate mandates. There should be an obligation for the scientists to discuss this. This obligation has never happened. The discussion has been led by politicians, by public health authorities who have no clue, who are overloaded with bureaucracy, who are talking all the time, going on all kinds of media, on TV, every time telling the same nonsense, right? So that is very, very unfortunate. So that's extremely sad.
Just one last question, and I know we don't have time to go deeply into it, but you've been working on T-cell vaccines, right?
No,
Or natural killer vaccines. Natural killer vaccines.
Yeah. Natural.
Is that something that is anywhere close to being, a reality in the marketplace? Something that we could actually use?
Yeah, well, it's difficult for me to talk about this because every time I talk about this, people are saying, yeah, Vanden Bosssche is just criticizing everybody and he's criticizing the approach because he's promoting his own ideas, etc. But frankly speaking, I've repeated it so many times. First of all, there is no patents on file, so how could I ever make money? People can verify my consultancy company. I'm not collaborating with big pharma, big industry, or whatever. There are no VCs on board, etc. But yes, I conceived this very interesting concept. Basically, what we are saying all the time is that the power of innate immunity towards this type of virus and a number of other viruses, also influenza virus, for example, is very, very important, to deal with the virus. So every kind of vaccine that would be able just to foster and to support and to strengthen the innate immune response, would be beneficial. Now, we know natural killer cells can do that. They can do that. So for me, this is a very interesting avenue, and the kind of approach that I developed is very, very simple. So it's something that could, I think, easily and rapidly be implemented at large scale. But of course, we would need to generate more data. It's not going to happen under these conditions. But all I want to say is that the concept for these viruses to foster and to support the innate immune response, because remember, when people are saying yes, elderly people who are immune suppressed, etc., are more susceptible or more vulnerable because their innate immunity is weaker, right? And for example, in children, etc. Well, the question is there ways to strengthen their innate immunity and to provide them with better protection, rather than going into this acquired branch of the adaptive immunity, where all things become very, very specific. And very specific is good if you have a prophylactic vaccine, as I explained. But when you do this during the pandemic, you need a kind of immune response that does not discriminate between specific epitopes on the spike protein. For example, these innate antibodies, they only recognize like sugar patterns on the virus. And these sugar patterns are shared amongst all the variants, even amongst all coronaviruses, right? And that is the way these innate antibodies can tackle the different variants. Of course, this first line of immune defense is relatively weak. So the virus can sometimes break through it. But then you get an acquired immune response that is specifically directed against the very last variant that was circulating, because that was the one that caused the disease and that generated the acquired antibodies. So it's basically an understanding from, a thorough understanding of immunology. That is the most dramatic shortage in the whole discussion about this pandemic. This is monopolized by virologists because it is a virus who very often don't understand the immunology. All they understand are neutralizing antibodies that are generated by the vaccines or naturally, etc. Don't talk them about innate immunity. They have never heard about this. They have never heard about the collaboration, the cooperation between innate and acquired immunity. If you see how they redefine herd immunity and all these definitions, it's just appalling, right? It's I have no words for it, but so that is the long answer to your short question.
Gert, thank you so much for spending this time with us and my viewers. I mean, it's so valuable, and just, thank you for your intellectual honesty and your courage in bringing this out. I mean, we could talk for hours because this is really complicated stuff. I mean, you need a few different degrees to really, keep up with you and understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, but the last thing I wanted to say is, and to your audience, what is key is that people begin to understand that this is complex, as you're saying, that this is really something that is a very sophisticated piece of theater of nature, right? That is very difficult to understand, especially if you intervene with things that we have never done before. If people would already understand that it is complex, that therefore it requires a very thorough debate before they simply decide to get their children vaccinated, and that this debate should take place, and that it is something completely different from just coercing people, to get vaccinated, because otherwise they can no longer travel, they lose their jobs, they can no longer go to school, they can no longer go to campus, etc. If that is the only thing that people draw, as kind of information from our conversation, that would already be extremely valuable. And I would also like to thank you and many others for giving us an opportunity, as a scientist also, to spread the word in a way that I think has high credibility, because we basically have only been discussing science, right? You don't hear me about conspiracy theories and blaming this guy and this guy, etc. The science and the things that we try to disentangle and to communicate to people, they would never reach people if there were not this kind of platforms and people who are also sticking out their neck to make this happen. So thanks to you as well. I much
Definitely.
appreciate it.
Yeah, I would also just one last thing like to tell everyone to share this interview because what I found is one of the things that really convinces people who are kind of on the fence or who just don't understand what's going on is when they hear somebody who's deeply versed in the science speak about it, and we have a dearth of those people speaking out, right? So I can't think of anyone else that's at your level in these different super important disciplines speaking out about this. You're really the only one I can think of who has that level of knowledge in the disciplines that are most important to understand.
Mhm.
And you can find him again at voiceforscienceandsolidarity.org. And again, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, it's thanks, Said, for having me. And if you share the podcast with us, we will definitely also put it on our website so that the message can be shared even more broadly.
Absolutely, I'll do that. All right. Thank you so much. Bye bye.